This lecture will be on relativism, particularly focusing on cultural relativism, and the discussion given in the reading by James Rachels. What exactly is relativism? Well, relativism in philosophy states that the truth of a statement about something, some subject matter, X, it depends on or are relative to how things are with some subject matter, Y. Basically, that's all that relativism means. It means that the facts of one set of things are relative to the facts of some other set of things. Now, relativism in general, at this sort of very abstract level, is actually pretty common. There's things like Einstein's theory of relativity, where ultimately it turns out that time and space are relative to your frame of reference. Hopefully you learned about something like that in your physics class. Similarly, in biology, phenotypic traits, kind of the outward appearance of individuals, animals and people, are relative, given the same genotype, your underlying gene structure, to differences in your environment. So you could have, you could have twins, the same genes, but brought up in different environments, and you would have different ultimate uh, expressions of phenotypic traits. These phenotypic traits are relative to facts about your genes and your environment. Here, though, we're worried or interested in the notion of moral relativism. The idea of moral relativism is the thought that moral truth, or morality, the rightness or wrongness of certain actions, is relative to or dependent on something else. People have thought for a long time that certain kinds of actions might be right or wrong, relative to certain cultural standpoints or certain things that individuals want or need, but that those moral sort of truths aren't actually absolute. A common thing one might hear when discussing whether certain actions are moral or immoral is that somebody might say, well, that's true for you, but it's not true for me. And this sort of idea or this expression reflects the notion of what we might call personal subjectivism. Personal subjectivism is a form of relativism that says that morality ultimately just depends on each person's subjective attitudes. That is, what I want to do determines what's right for me to do. Some examples here of this form of personal subjectivism might be something like vegetarianism. Some people think that it is wrong to eat animals, but they think that it's wrong for themselves, right? They say things like, "Well, I don't want to judge anybody else for eating animals, but I could never eat animals. It's wrong for me." Similarly, the way that I grade is personally subjective. I will give some of you Fs because I don't like you, and some of you As because I like you. That was a joke. Now, there are forms of relativism that do seem, in one way or another, correct. Take, for example, issues of taste. If a person really enjoys chocolate ice cream, then it might be true that chocolate ice cream is better for them than vanilla ice cream. But does that make chocolate ice cream better all across the board? No. Chocolate ice cream might be good or better relative to the individual person's tastes. But that doesn't make it objectively the case that some flavor is better than another. Taste is a perfect example of a case in which oftentimes things are relative to individuals' preferences. James Rachels introduced the notion of cultural relativism in his paper, The Challenge of Cultural Relativism. And the basic idea of cultural relativism kind of crops up in the thinking of anthropologists and sociologists over the last century. The basic idea being that ultimately different cultures around the world have different moral codes. And the thought then is that this like this fact, the fact that different cultures have different moral codes, is thought to be key to understanding ethics on the whole. The basic idea being something like that because different cultures have different moral codes, a universal ethical theory, a theory that says, that holds all of these ethical codes to account, must be a myth. Um, the idea being that, look, there are different moral customs that different cultures have, and we shouldn't be able to criticize these as incorrect or problematic in some way, because that implies that we have some sort of independent standard from which to judge. And, that's problematic. The idea being, Western culture has colonized many parts of the world and, sort of chased out certain cultural norms and imposed their own. That seems bad. Nowadays, we recognize that that was a problematic way of thinking. We need to decolonize. We need to decentralize this general white Western centralized way of thinking. The way that these cultural anthropologists tend to think is something like this. Ultimately, different societies have different moral codes. So there's no objective standard from which we can judge one society and one society's moral code as somehow better than another. That being the case, the moral code of our own society doesn't have some special status. It isn't somehow above and beyond other cultural societies' moral codes. It's just one among many. And then the idea is that what follows from this is that, well, then there's no ultimately universal ethical theory. There's no universal truth in ethics. There's no moral truths that hold for all peoples at all times. It's all relative to the different cultural standards that have been set at that time by that culture. The moral code of a particular society is basically what determines what's right or wrong for members of that society. So if the moral code of a society says that a certain kind of action is right, then that action just is right because the society says so. And the basic idea here from the anthropological perspective is that it's arrogant for us to try to judge the conduct of other societies, other groups of people. And that instead what we should do is adopt a kind of attitude of tolerance towards those practices and those cultures. All of this leads us to what Rachel sees as the main argument for cultural relativism. So here's the argument. Different cultures have different moral codes. If different cultures have different moral codes, then none of these codes are objectively right or wrong. Therefore, none of these moral codes is objectively correct or incorrect, right or wrong. This is just a form of a modus ponens style argument. Now, is this argument a good argument? Is it strong? Does it establish its conclusion? Let's consider each of the premises. Premise 1 states that different cultures have different moral codes. Is there good evidence for believing this? It seems so. Different cultures in different places have believed different kinds of things, and believe that different kinds of things are right or different kinds of things are wrong. Take the example that Rachel's goes over in the sort of Mediterranean. You've got two people that are just separated by some water, and on one group of people they think that the right way to treat the dead is to bury them or is to burn them, and the other people think that the right way to treat the dead is to eat them. Who's right and who's wrong? It doesn't seem, I mean, here, these different cultures clearly have different moral codes, and so that seems plausibly to lend support to premise 1. But what about premise 2? Premise 2 states that if different cultures have different moral codes, then none of these codes are objectively right or wrong. Is this conditional true? Remember, conditional statements are false just in case it's possible for the antecedent to be true, the first part, while the consequent is false. So, if this conditional is false, then you just have to come up with a case in which it's true that different cultures have different moral codes, but it's false that none of these codes are objectively right or wrong. The claim that disagreement between cultures really gives us reason to think that there's no truth of the matter seems actually pretty problematic. Just because two people disagree shouldn't tell us or give us any reason for thinking that both of them, like that there's no right or wrong answer between the two. Disagreement just doesn't work that way. Think about people that believe in flat Earth. Does the fact that there's a society of people that disagree with modern science about the shape and size of the Earth mean that there's no fact of the matter? It's just neither true nor false. There's no objective fact that the Earth is round or spherical. Of course not. The main argument then for cultural relativism that states that just because people have disagreements, that different cultures disagree over certain cultural standards, doesn't actually tell us that none of the cultural standards are right or wrong. It may give us reason to be tolerant of other cultures because we might recognize that our own cultural standard may be incorrect, or we shouldn't judge others from our own standard. But that doesn't mean that there's not some standard that is the correct one, and that the differences and the disagreements between other cultures reflects the fact that some cultures can be wrong when they believe certain things are okay and not okay to do. Rachel suggests a series of considerations about why ultimately cultural relativism is a somewhat implausible moral theory. If cultural relativism is true, then it turns out that we can no longer judge the customs of other societies as morally inferior to ours, including our own past society. So if moral relativism is true, then judging the times at which slavery was considered okay is not in some way morally inferior. Similarly, anyone that practices certain ritual problematic situations or practices, right? The stoning of women for sleeping sleeping with someone outside of wedlock in the Middle East. Those kinds of practices we cannot actually judge as morally problematic. Two, if cultural relativism is true, then we could determine whether an action is right or wrong simply by looking at the cultural standards of our own society. On this view, the thought is, look, determining whether or not something is actually right or wrong in certain cases is rather difficult. But according to this thought, cultural relativism just simply determines the rightness or wrongness of certain actions. And so all we have to do in order to know that an action is right or wrong is take a poll. If 51% of people say, yeah, good, that's fine, then, oh, look, that action is right. Three, if cultural relativism is true, then there's ultimately no true moral progress. That means that, if cultural relativism is true, there's simply no moving from a place in which a society is less moral to a place in which a society is more moral. That is, we can't become better as a society. All we can do is shift our opinions. There's another reason for worrying about cultural disagreement. That is, that different cultures have disagreements about what's correct and what's incorrect given their moral codes. It might be that these disagreements between cultures are deep disagreements about the basis of certain moral facts, but it could also be that these disagreements are simply merely superficial disagreements on the surface. So the question then is whether or not these disagreements between cultures is actually about morality or about basic facts about the world. There are many forms of what we might think of as superficial disagreement. So take, for example, the different societies, one of which thinks that you ought to eat your dead, and the other of which thinks that you ought to cremate your dead. Now, suppose that the reasons behind these things is, so one society, they think that you ought to eat your dead because that is ultimately the only way that the dead can rest and not become ghosts or something like that. Whereas the other society thinks No, 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 no. It's not. It doesn't have to do with eating the dead. It has to do with burning the dead. And the only way to release their souls into the ether is by setting them ablaze. Now, in that situation, ultimately, do these societies have a deep moral disagreement, or do they have a superficial one? Well, as I've explained the situation, they actually just have a superficial disagreement. They superficially disagree about the facts, about the idea that in order for an individual to be released from their worldly body, they must either be eaten or they must be burned. But one way or the other, who knows? Another example might be like, think about today. Nobody today believes that it is acceptable to sacrifice virgins by throwing them into volcanoes in order to satisfy the volcano gods, right? Or something like that. That would be wrong. And that's because we know nowadays that there are no volcano gods or, funny things like that, that we need to somehow satiate their desire for, virgins. However, even if we disagreed with a culture that, still tried to practice ritual virgin sacrifice, imagine a scenario in which what they were sacrificing the virgin to was actually correct, right? There's a monster that lives in a volcano, and it would actually destroy the village if they didn't sacrifice a person. Now, if there was, this is a wild science fiction type scenario, but in that sort of scenario, would we actually disagree with this culture, morally speaking, and say, no, it's wrong. You shouldn't sacrifice the virgin? Well, maybe not, right? It might be the only way to save a lot of lives is to sacrifice one individual. And that's an interesting moral question as to whether or not that's true. But we could agree on that. And, even while we disagree about certain other superficial facts. However, I think that in this situation, were it to be similar for us, right? I mean, like any sci-fi scenario, were it to be the case that we actually had to sacrifice individuals to save a lot of humans in this crazy outlandish scenario, we might do it. And if that's the case, then ultimately what's going on here are forms of superficial disagreement rather than deep moral disagreement. It seems that most cultures, for the generally, do, in order to survive, have a kind of core set of values, and it seems implausible that any cultural culture or society could actually survive without holding to some core set of values. Those values being things like taking care of children, prohibition on murder, the cooperation with respect to labor, so people helping each other with respect to work, and cooperation with respect to communication. If people were just constantly lying to one another, nothing would ever get, nobody would ever believe anything anyone said, and nobody would ever get anything done. Now, these kinds of core values seem to be shared by every society known to mankind. And at the very least, then, if there's some kind of core underpinning to certain moral viewpoints, then we might have good reason to reject a kind of cultural relativistic standpoint. Now, this doesn't actually mean that we shouldn't be tolerant of other cultures and other cultural practices. We should be open-minded and skeptical of our own actions and always thinking that what we're doing is right because it's what we're doing. But that doesn't mean that we should just sort of be open-ended and allow anything to go. We shouldn't take on an anything goes attitude. In fact, I think that we can, from a certain standpoint, recognize what kinds of things are basic human goods and, try and strive to change our own culture as well as other cultures to respect those basic human goods. This kind of view allows for what we might think of as moral pluralism. It's not the case that everything is relative to individual cultures, but maybe it's true that there are a number of different objective moral values, but there's no single objectively best ordering of those values. So different cultures may share the same moral values at the core, but who's to say that one core moral value is more important than another? If that's true, then ultimately different societies could look different morally speaking, while continuing to hold to the same underlying objective moral truths. An example of this form of moral pluralism might be given along these kinds of lines. Take the difference between what we might think of as an individualistic culture and a collectivist culture. Often this is thought of to reflect in Eastern versus Western cultures, where Eastern cultures are more collectivist and Western cultures are more individualistic. In collectivist cultures, generally, the same core moral principles are accepted. You want people to have rights. You want people to live well. However, it is thought of generally that the thing that takes moral precedent is the group. Everybody tries to work for the goodness of everyone, the goodness of all. Whereas in individualistic cultures, the things that tend to be focused on are particular individuals and their particular achievements and the particular rights. So in both cultures, these sort of core moral principles might be recognized, but in one culture, the thing that seems to be more important is like the group, whereas in the other culture, the thing that seems to be more important is the rights of the individual. So now comparing kind of moral pluralism to moral relativism, there are a number of pros on the pluralist side against the relativist side. First, pluralism allows for moral absolutes, a core set of moral claims or principles that everyone can share, even if we differ with respect to the ordering of those principles and how they get sort of expressed in society, whereas relativism does not. Relativism takes that there are no moral absolutes, there's just morality relative to society. Pluralism also helps to explain why sometimes we should be tolerant and sometimes we shouldn't be tolerant of cultures at different times, right? So we should be tolerant maybe of certain religious practices of other cultures. We shouldn't say that they're doing something wrong or problematic, but we should be intolerant when people are acting in ways that oppress other individuals. Relativism, however, pushes a kind of constant tolerance, saying that, well, no matter what your moral stance is from your culture, there's nothing correct or incorrect about it. Ultimately, then, also, relativism cannot condone or reject certain actions as atrocities or moral victories, neither. Whereas pluralism allows for these. So just think, on the relativistic view, what the Nazis were doing in Germany during World War II, wasn't ultimately an atrocity, given that it was acceptable from their point of view, and that just seems rather implausible, right? The liberation of the Jews from concentration camps should be seen as a moral victory, and according to relativism, it's maybe it's a moral victory for certain Western cultures, but there's no objective fact of the matter that says that it ultimately was really truly a good thing. It's just that it was good for particular individuals. Pluralism allows us to make these kinds of claims and explain why they're true. So in the end, is moral relativism just out as a theory? Well, maybe. There are three sort of different closely related moral theories that, two related to moral relativism that you might be actually more interested in one of which is, I think, rather implausible, but one of which is more plausible, and it seems like a natural outcropping for anyone interested in the ideas of moral relativism. So, of course, moral relativism says that morality is relative to something other than the moral facts, like that there really isn't any sort of objective moral facts out there. There's just societies that impose certain norms on individuals, and that's what makes them right or wrong. Whereas moral nihilism is the idea that ultimately there's just no moral truth at all, and so anything kind of goes. Now, that seems, I think, rather implausible, because at the very least, seemingly there are some morally correct or incorrect things to do, given how societies operate. But you might think something different than moral relativism is true. You might accept that there are certain moral truths at bottom, but that those moral truths aren't in some way, built into the structure of reality or based on God's say so or something like that, right? You might think, and the view here is what's called moral anti-realism. You might think that moral truths don't exist sort of out in the world. Moral truths depend on the ways that human beings are, the ways that we have our certain attitudes towards things and certain emotions towards things. And this kind of view actually is still alive and well in the sort of moral landscape and ethics today. This kind of view people tend to call like emotivism or prescriptivism, where the idea is that ultimately different kinds of moral truths have to do with the way in which we treat things rather than the way in which things actually are.